This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
All right. Kind of running on fumes right now. I'm sort of in one of those weird cycles right now where my sleep schedule's a bit off. So while I'm physically awake, I don't know if I'm fully operating at 100%. But we'll try to barrel through this one and not be lethargic. What do you say? I think I do myself a disservice when I try to take naps. The rare times in the week where I actually have 5 minutes to do that. Yeah, I took one of those, what are they called? Power naps. I think that's what I often hear people refer to them as. I mean, it was probably like a half hour at most. But I even remember waking up on Friday afternoon and just thinking, man, that was a bad idea. Because I know what happens. You try to sleep in the afternoon for a little bit, and of course you go to bed later that night and you're fully wired until like 11 o'clock. Which is very abnormal for me because I'm usually in bed by like 9:30 or 10. Of course, I get up early. I'm just a mess right now. I also don't know how, but I think I may have dislocated my hip at the gym. Which is always something you like admitting to at the ripe age of 35. Is there any better way to make yourself look old? Talking about dislocating your hip. Yeah, that'll do it. Well, thankfully this weekend was pretty stress-free when it came to the wrestling content. So I wasn't killing myself trying to fit everything in. We have added the classic NXT review series to the discussion panel, which we will get into momentarily. Suffice it to say, I'm relatively enjoying this new podcast model, much like I am with the Friday one. The shows aren't perfect. In the case of Retro Raw, that is borderline impossible, especially for 1994. And, while the NXT shows from 2013 are not necessarily home runs, it's, there's kind of a cool nostalgia factor that comes with reviewing and rewatching a lot of those shows again. It's been a long time, so I think it'll be a fun addition. But we do have much to talk about on the show today, so let me go ahead and do my plugs while they're on my mind, because I know I'm going to forget. Make sure that if you're watching the FSWR channel for the first time, subscribe, comment, like the show. Come back to check us out on YouTube and Rumble every Monday and Friday for new content. We got a lot of different wrestling topics and shows that we're addressing right now, all of which are different and unique in their own ways. We got classic 80s wrestling, classic 90s wrestling, up to and including all the modern stuff we're talking about with SmackDown and all the WWE Premium Live specials. So if you enjoy classic wrestling in particular, and you'd like to hear a different perspective on things from somebody that grew up watching and liking old school pro wrestling, back when I could still call it that and not be ashamed of myself for doing so, then this is definitely the podcast for you. A serious wrestling channel that promotes serious grassroots wrestling. which is probably the perfect segue into Retro Raw, because, well, if anything describes Monday Night Raw from 1994, it's serious. As we continue to kick the can down the road with Retro Raw, the question remains, can we get a good one? Is it too much to ask? Was that Bob Backlund segment last week a rare gem? The one good Raw segment we've got in the last 9 months. Well, I think we got the answer this week. The answer was, yes, it was. It was too much to ask. Because we were right back to the status quo. Yet another week goes by where I have to sit here and remind myself, who exactly was the World Wrestling Federation champion at the time? Considering his absence from the show for like the 17th week in a row. It's Brett, by the way. And their one featured match for the program this week is a completely random Intercontinental Championship match between Razor Ramon and Tatanka with no build. Another situation where I ask, when the hell did Razor become the Intercontinental Champion? And then I remembered midway through the match, oh yeah, that's right. He beat Diesel at the pay-per-view. I already forgot. That is how quickly SummerSlam 1994 was lost on me. So yeah, it's Razor versus Tatanka, the now corporate suit-wearing Tatanka, the real turncoat, and the one that was raking Luger over the coals for months, claiming that he was the one that sold out for Ted DiBiase and the corporation. It was a swerve. And not one fuck was given. So I guess this was Tatanka's payoff for scoring the fluke win over Luger at the pay-per-view. He got to wrestle Razor for the IC title here on Raw. A match that, again, I don't remember them hyping from the previous week. I definitely know they didn't shoot an angle for it. If they did plug it, it certainly went over my head. And like, I don't know. It's easy enough for me to sit here and say the character dynamics were totally ass backwards here. Tatanka is a heel. I mean, he tried. He's out there trying to be a bad guy. Funny enough, in a match with the guy whose moniker was the bad guy, Razor Ramon. Yet he's the babyface. And Tatanka's supposed to be the heel. Anyway, they're doing this match. It's okay. Okay enough to lull people into a coma, but it's not terrible or anything. It's just not really all that exciting. They're just kind of going through the motions. They're having a match. People aren't really into it. They do the fake abdominal stretch spot where Tatanka reaches through the ropes and uses DiBiase's hand for leverage. It's a classic heat spot in wrestling that we've seen a million times before. Problem was that Tatanka did not even try to make it look like he was applying any kind of pressure to the back of Razor. So he just kind of awkwardly stood there like he was giving Razor casual anal. And they do the long, over-dramatic sequence on the floor right toward the finish where DiBiase lures Razor out of the ring. And while Tatanka is in slow pursuit of Razor, they take about 5 years to actually get to the payoff of Tatanka attacking Razor from behind. Like Razor stalking DiBiase outside the ring for what feels like an eternity before he finally gets cut off. And then the actual finish, stop me if you've heard this before, lame count out. Here's what happens. Tatanka rolls Razor back into the ring. Lex Luger starts charging down the aisleway, but he's immediately cut off by Bam Bam. And while Luger is fighting Bam Bam in the aisleway, here comes Tatanka to even the odds. Sort of. He evened the odds for the heels. And somehow during that melee, Tatanka just gets counted out. Even though I'm pretty sure Razor was already out brawling with those guys by the time the bell had rung. So why it was not a double count out, I have no idea. All I know is that they abruptly cut to commercial while everybody's doing the pull apart. And then they come back with Vince and Macho Man already moving on with the show like nothing just happened. 20 minutes into the show, I was already over it. But you'll be happy to know, the Luger-Tatanka program, it appears to be continuing. So you can all sleep well at night, knowing we'll get to see that classic showdown again. Maybe they'll go from having a 1-star match to a 1.25-star match. The possibilities. From there, we go to a pre-tape with The Undertaker and Paul Bearer, standing by an open casket. I was going to write from an undisclosed location. It was not totally apparent at first where they were filming this from, what with all the ominous pink lighting going on. Looking at the background, though, I'm pretty sure it was just the boiler room. And among some of my favorite quotes in this segment, we had Paul Bearer promoting the Heart Attack Tour by telling Yokozuna that it may in fact be him who will suffer a heart attack. Too soon? Yeah. And then The Undertaker vowed to place Yokozuna's carcass inside this casket to finally seal the deal and take his soul. And before they cut away, we get the very comical visual of Paul Bearer wagging his finger at the casket lid and looking mean. This is where I wrote, the vintage WWF ending to skits where we must awkwardly keep the camera on the wrestlers for an extra 30 seconds and make everybody look like jackasses. Taker had it easy because all he had to do was put his head down. Paul, though, he got hung out to dry. To be fair, there was a lot more to say about that than there was Quang versus Rich Myers. I mean, I think this was mostly just a big infomercial so Vince could make jokes about the Macho Man getting traded to the Phoenix Cardinals, the football team, for those curious. I mean, I don't claim to know jack shit about sports. I never have. I'm just reporting on what happened here. I have no idea who Phil Simms is, nor do I care. How it had any relevancy to what was happening in the ring, your guess is as good as mine. Unless it was some obscure reference to the XFL, which I don't believe was a concept for another 7 years. And in that case, where's the XFL today? Exactly. A blimp on the radar in terms of relevancy. Quang won with a spinning thrust kick. The epitome of filler was this match. At which point, we come back for a King's Court segment with Jerry Lawler and the British Bulldog. And I already kind of knew what was coming before Davey Boy even came out here. I was like, what are the odds we get Lawler making 50 terrible dog jokes in a row? Well, if you bet against it, you are a fool. So here comes Bulldog down the aisleway, arguably in the best shape he's ever looked during his career. And this was after taking a couple years off. He certainly did not slack off at the gym. Probably 3% body fat at most. Anyway, well, the jokes are horrible, for one. But you always know, when you get a visible pop out of Vince, you're in good hands. Lawler made some toupee jokes about Vince's hair and said when he approaches a fire hydrant, one half of his hair flips up in the air. You know, piss jokes. Yeah. Bathroom humor. Vince got a chuckle out of that one. And, well, then Lawler started teasing that he was going to insult Davey Boy's wife, and that did not go over so well. And eventually, here comes the Anvil, and he's going off on how the Bulldog had no business getting involved at SummerSlam. He says that he's not a member of the Hart family, and he never was. To which Davey Boy responds by saying, well, actually, legally speaking, I married Brett's sister. So, in fact, yes, by law, that does make me an honorary member of the Hart family. He's not wrong. And eventually the Anvil got pissed, and he challenged Bulldog to a match next week. To which I wrote down in my notes, not having thought anything of it at the time, but the thought just occurred to me as I'm recapping this. We're going to get to see the British Bulldog versus Jim Neidhart live? Well, that sounds rather ghastly. Surely it turns out to be better than I'm expecting it to be, right? I mean, I've seen plenty of Anvil matches in my day. God love him. But he is far from what you would call a remarkable athlete. Borderline immobile. And Bulldog's really not renowned for having great matches himself. Discount the one he had with Brett at SummerSlam 92. And Brett gets most of the credit for carrying Davey Boy in that match. Well, now we're 2 years after the fact. Bulldog hasn't wrestled a match in the WWF since that point. So this one is, oh, this one's got me on edge. I'm totally expecting a train wreck. Maybe it won't be so bad. I'm optimistic. I know I will immediately eat my words by the time next week rolls around. Davey Boy versus Jim Neidhart. Good God in heaven. Speaking of guys that ate their own words, how about Louis Gianfrido? Yeah. Remember when he tried to accept Bob Backlund's chicken wing challenge? Yeah, that didn't go over so well, did it? They re-aired that gem this week. An all-time great Raw segment thrust into the middle of the shit soup that was 1994. And as we learned here, very good news. Louis only suffered, according to Vince, a minor shoulder separation. Well, good. I'm glad. As opposed to a major shoulder separation, I guess. What does that mean? I have no clue. Vince's medical terminology. At least we didn't have to hear he was transported to a local medical facility following the program. So then we had the 1-2-3 Kid versus Kerry Davis. And the first thing I wrote down here immediately upon the opening bell, my God, Kerry Davis. How in the fuck was this man permitted to be on national cable television? Fuck, dude. Seriously. I mean, we've seen some NWA jobbers with pretty pathetic physiques. Kerry Davis may have looked worse than all of those men combined. Vince was openly taking shots at him on commentary, but I don't even think he was doing it justice. This guy made Joey Janela look less outlaw by comparison. Every possible stereotype you can make about a guy with a rotten body, this dude, he was the poster boy. He embodied it all. Pale, fat, plump, short, straggly long hair, terrible scruffy beard, way too much estrogen in his body. Like the kind of guy that you would easily mistake for a homeless bum. Seriously, this guy, they let this guy work without a shirt on. I'm not kidding. I nearly threw up. When I saw this guy's hideous man titties bulging out in broad daylight, I nearly vomited. Of all times to not hit the censor function, this guy needed it. Meanwhile, kids in there having to work with this big tub of goo. God love Sean Waldman. And while the match is in progress, out comes Bob Backlund carrying a present. And he walks it over to pass it off to the Macho Man. Of course, Vince and Savage are wondering what the deal is. It's funny, as they're speculating on what could be inside this gift box, Vince opens up the letter that was sitting on top of the package. His first words are, "Let me get my cheaters so I can read this." I just thought, God, Vince was old back then. To think he would last another 30 plus years running this fucking ship. Vince McMahon needing cheaters in 1994 to read up close. Good Lord. Turns out the package was a dictionary. Because we all know Mr. Backlund was an advocate of the English language. I mean, he loved making fun of the Americans for having low IQs. What better way to make people look stupid than by pointing out how many words he knew? And, well, somewhere during all this, Kid won with the top rope leg drop. I mean, I think the angle with Backlund was mostly done so they could keep the camera off of Davis as much as humanly possible. And for the record, this was a thick-ass dictionary the Macho Man was browsing through. I am not convinced the English language had that many words in 1994. The level of thickness to this book. I mean, unless they were tacking on other languages. Maybe there was some Pig Latin in there too. It was a big book though. And then following that, we had a rather cartoony hype package for the returning King Kong Bundy. In this, I had totally forgotten about the return of King Kong Bundy in the WWF during this period. Like, this is coming fresh off his semi-retirement run after he left in '88. I can't remember. I think he was doing some work in Memphis in early '94, like right before they signed him to a deal where he came back in September. You know, it's funny too, because while he was only around for maybe like a year or so for his second run here, he does end up wrestling Taker in next year's Mania. Arguably not one of Taker's better Mania matches, but I do have vague memories of that match happening. Yet at no